Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of Josephine Gray from Maryland. Josephine was born in 1946. Very little is known about her early life, but court documents would later make reference to her difficult childhood, the details of which are unknown. What we do know is that as a young adult, Josephine was known to be a flamboyant character who liked to drive flashy cars and wear eye-catching outfits. Despite her outgoing, gregarious nature, she was attracted to quiet, kind men, and in 1967, at the age of 21, she married a man by the name of Norman Stribling. Josephine worked as a custodian for the Montgomery County Public Schools, a position which she had held throughout her adult life. Josephine and Norman had 5 children together, but their marriage was far from happy. At some point in the early 1970s, Josephine took an additional part-time job cleaning offices, and here she met a man by the name of William Gray. Mr. Gray went by his middle name, Robert. Robert was in his early 30s and married with 6 children when he met Josephine. Up until this point in his life, Robert had been a real family man, doting on his wife and children. However, this soon changed when he met Josephine. Robert's friends and family stated that it was like something inside of him had snapped and his entire demeanour and personality changed. Robert and Josephine had started an affair, and Robert became increasingly distant towards those who knew him. He stopped visiting his friends or paying attention to his family. When the affair was discovered, those close to Robert felt that Josephine had some kind of hold over him. Robert's wife, Frances, would later comment that she believed that Josephine must have been adding something to Robert's food in order to make him do as she said. Frances believed that this theory was confirmed when Robert stopped eating any food prepared by Josephine and his former personality returned. Josephine had a collection of powders, roots and teas hidden in her bedroom, and when Robert was once again in her company, his strange, distant persona would return. Meanwhile, Norman, who had realised that his wife was having an affair, had become increasingly fearful of Josephine. Rumours were rife that Josephine was dealing in witchcraft and voodoo. Norman told those close to him that he feared for his life and that he had seen his name in spells that Josephine had written. Norman's fears were justified when, one night, he woke up to find Josephine pointing a gun at him. His life was spared as the weapon misfired and he was able to escape. On the 4th of March 1974, Norman was not as fortunate. His body was found in his car on an isolated road in Gaithersburg, Maryland, a short distance from his home. He had been killed by a single shot to the right side of his head in what initially looked like a robbery. However, before long, 2 witnesses had independently approached the police to state that Josephine had offered them $5,000 in return for murdering Norman. 2 weeks later, Josephine and Robert were arrested and charged with Norman's murder. It didn't take long before all charges against the pair were dropped. Key witnesses either refused to cooperate with the police or could no longer be found, and without the witnesses, the prosecution simply did not have a case. The authorities soon realised that a very unusual form of witness intimidation was being used. As irrational as it may seem to some people, family members and witnesses were terrified by the idea that Josephine had the ability to practice witchcraft and voodoo, and as such refused to speak up against her. A member of Norman's family would later describe him as being under a magic spell that caused him to uncontrollably scratch his face to shreds. When Norman's life insurance policy paid out, Josephine received around $15,000. That's the equivalent of around $85,000 today. She used this money towards the purchase of a house with her new fiancé, Robert Gray. In November of 1975, a year and a half after Norman's murder, the pair married, and soon after Josephine gave birth to their first and only child together. It was Josephine's 6th child and Robert's 7th. According to Robert's mother, her son's marriage was never a happy one, and this was compounded when, in the mid-1980s, Josephine's second cousin, Clarence Good, came to live with them. Clarence was a teenager at the time and was having a hard time where he lived in Brooklyn, New York. Josephine promised her relatives that she would take good care of Clarence, and he moved to live with Josephine and Robert in Maryland. At some point in the late 1980s, it was reported that Josephine and Clarence began an affair. She remained married and living with Robert, while she had an affair with Clarence, who lived under the same roof. By the summer of 1990, the situation had become unlivable. At one point, Josephine chased Robert through their home with a gun. He had to jump from a second-floor window to escape her and ran to his parents' house, which was about a mile away. Robert finally decided that he'd had enough and would move out for good. Josephine continued her affair with Clarence, and it is believed she simultaneously started an affair with one of her co-workers. Like Norman before him, Robert began telling those closest to him that he feared for his life. He said that Josephine had assaulted him on several occasions, and when, in August 1990, she allegedly attacked him at his place of work with a baseball bat and knife, he brought criminal charges against her. A hearing regarding this assault was scheduled for the 5th of October, but a continuance was issued until November the 16th. Following the hearing on the 5th of October, Robert was driving when Josephine started following his car. She started flashing her headlights, indicating that she wanted him to pull over. Robert tried to ignore her, but she pulled alongside his car, and as she did so, Clarence pointed a gun directly at Robert. Panicked by this, Robert managed to put the car into reverse and escape. Again, this incident was reported to the police, and Robert began changing the beneficiary on his life insurance policies to ensure that Josephine had nothing to gain from his death. Robert rented an apartment in Georgetown and invited his family over for a celebration. It seemed that Robert was back to his old self, with one of his children commenting that the spell was broken and that they finally had their dad back. Less than a week later, on the 9th of November 1990, 1 week before Josephine and Clarence were due back in court, Robert was shot dead. He had finished work at Clopper Mill Elementary School, where he was a building services manager, at around 2:30 p.m. He returned home, and as he walked into his apartment, someone was waiting inside. They fired 2 shots, hitting him in the neck and chest. His body was found by his father and a family friend who had become concerned for his welfare. The business card of a police detective who he had been asking for help was next to his body. It took 6 months of investigation before Josephine and Clarence were charged with Robert's murder. Josephine was also charged for a second time with Norman's murder. It was reported that 2 of Josephine and Norman's children, 26-year-old Brenda and 23-year-old Bernard, told investigators that they believed their mother was responsible for their father's murder and that she had also been planning the murder of their stepfather. Additionally, statements made by Josephine's brother, Donald Mills, and her daughter, Regina Gray, implicated Josephine in the murders. However, when the 2 defendants were released on bail, the prosecution's case began to fall apart. It immediately became clear that there was a marked difference in witness cooperation from when Josephine was being held to when she was out on bail. Both Donald Mills and Regina Gray recanted their incriminating statements. During the investigation into Robert's murder, Josephine was asked about her involvement in witchcraft and voodoo. She denied being involved in either, calling it absurd. "I do not practice no voodoo and I do not practice no witchcraft. Just because I go and buy a lucky charm to play the lottery, or something to buy herbs and drink herb tea, or take olive oil and anoint myself. That's in the Bible." However, prosecutors believed otherwise and felt that the whole investigation was permeated with fear. On the 4th of September 1991, a judge ruled that they would allow evidence at trial of a phone conversation between Josephine and a voodoo doctor. This voodoo doctor, Rosie Sims, had gone to the police to tell them that Josephine had approached her about killing her husband. Soon after, prosecutors stated that Rosie Sims, who was on probation at the time, could no longer be located. On the 1st of October 1991, it was reported that prosecutors had dropped the charges against Josephine for Robert's murder, but the trial would still go ahead for Norman's murder 17 years earlier. The then Assistant State's Attorney, Thomas Tam, stated that the charges were dropped for strategic reasons, which included the preservation of the state's right to refile them at a later date. 7 weeks later, on the 19th of November 1991, the charges against Josephine for Norman's murder were also dropped due to a key witness in the case being missing and others refusing to testify. This was the second time that charges were dropped after a witness disappeared. Despite the changes he had made to some of his life insurance policies, Josephine still received over $50,000 after Robert's death. She used this money to pay off the balance owed on her home, which she had initially financed with her first husband's life insurance payout. With no outstanding charges against them, Josephine and Clarence carried on with their life together. However, Clarence had become increasingly isolated and miserable. Josephine would not allow him to have his own key to their home, a car, or any money of his own. In 1996, Josephine threatened Clarence with a knife, after which he moved out of their home. He began to stay with relatives around the Baltimore area, wherever he could find a bed for the night. He started to gain a little independence when he began working for the armoured car service, Loomis, but made what would ultimately become a fatal error when he allowed the insurance policy, of which Josephine was the beneficiary, to lapse. With no premiums being paid, the policy would only remain in effect for a further 60 days. On the 21st of June 1996, Baltimore police found Clarence's body in the boot of his car. He had been shot with a 9mm handgun. Prior to his murder, Clarence had told his sister Veronica that he was going to visit Josephine. He had also spoken to people about how he felt as though his life was in danger and how scared he had become of Josephine. Following the discovery of Clarence's body, Josephine's house was searched and some 9mm bullets were found. There was a large stain on the garage floor which tested positive for blood, and a commercial vacuum cleaner which also contained traces of blood. However, there was still not enough evidence to charge Josephine with Clarence's murder. Once again, Josephine received a life insurance payout. This time it was around $100,000. It would seem that Josephine had got away with murder yet again. Frustrated by this, prosecutors decided upon a new strategy to bring Josephine to justice. She was now dating a man by the name of Andre Savoy, who had no idea what had happened to the 3 other men. Again, in this relationship, Josephine controlled everything, with 48-year-old Andre often being seen by neighbours locked out of his own home, as Josephine did not allow him to have his own set of keys. When the police reached out to him, he agreed to help. On the 7th of November 2001, a federal grand jury indicted Josephine with 8 counts of mail and wire fraud for collecting the money from the insurance policies. The indictment stated that she had intentionally caused the deaths of her former partners and then concealed her roles in the deaths in order to claim on the victims' life insurance policies. These policies would be covered by Maryland's so-called Slayer's Rule, which prevents any person who intentionally kills the insured to receive the benefits of the policy. These charges did not require Josephine to be found guilty of murder to gain a conviction. The prosecutors just had to prove that she had a role in each death. Due to her history of threatening witnesses, she was held without bail at Prince George's County Detention Centre whilst awaiting trial. During this time, she called Andre and warned him to take the fifth and remain silent rather than testifying against her. The trial began in July 2002 and Josephine pleaded not guilty to all charges. The prosecution claimed that she was a master manipulator who used each lover to kill their predecessor. She was accused of ruling her husbands and others close to her with violence and intimidation. An incantation was caught on tape and voodoo ritual materials, including a voodoo doll made with real hair, were discovered in Josephine's home. However, the defence claimed that this mother of 6 and grandmother of 11 was a 3-time surviving victim who had been subject to relentless gossip, rumour and innuendo. They stated that she had received life insurance payouts, which she was perfectly entitled to, in order to make a better life for her children and grandchildren. They went on to claim that many of the prosecution's witnesses had been involved in insurance disputes with Josephine over the years, and much of the prosecution's case was based on statements heard over 20 years earlier. After a 3-week trial, the jury found Josephine guilty of all counts. She was subsequently given the maximum sentence for her crimes, 40 years in prison. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read out, but made a statement through her public defender, maintaining her innocence, stating that she gives her faith in God as a higher power who knows she has committed no offence or done anything wrong. In 2006, she tried to appeal her sentence based on the Supreme Court's 2005 decision that the use of mandatory sentences was unconstitutional. However, the original sentence was reaffirmed. She is currently being held at FMC Carswell, a federal prison in Fort Worth, Texas, and she has an earliest release date of 26th of February 2037, when she will be 91 years old. That concludes today's case. I would like to thank Renee Dennis for suggesting this story. She left a comment on the Jill Coit case. With Renee, if a case has been on television, Renee will always comment to say which show it has been on. And on this case, she tells me this was profiled on Deadly Women. Please add any comments down below and click like and subscribe. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Josephine Gray is sometimes referred to as the Voodoo Queen. Goodbye.